Good morning, everybody. It's a cold Saturday morning, so I really warmly welcome you here today. The theme of our conference is Technology and Major Programs, Mastering Scaling. Major programs are transformational $1 billion plus investments. They often can change the fate of countries and companies. These investments in big IT systems, infrastructure, energy and transport networks, smart cities, digital transformation programs are essential to modern society. Yet the benefits do not scale to all 7.6 billion people. Technology offers a promise of scaling. So as a result, we've gathered here today to talk about how technology in major programs, and that is digital transformation programs, also large systems within organizations, and technology in construction can offer the benefits of scaling to all humans on the planet. It's quite a big agenda, an ambitious agenda for the day. We are thrilled to welcome so many practitioners to Oxford once again, alongside leaders from government and academia. Vitruvius, the great Roman master builder and architect, said, "Master building is the child of reflection and practice." So we are thrilled that so many of practitioners are here, and what better place to reflect than the world's best university. So a very warm welcome to the 2018 Oxford Major Program Management Conference. It's also my great pleasure to welcome Dean Peter Tufano to extend his invitation to you for an exciting day as well. Peter has had a phenomenal scholarly career writing about consumer finance, financial innovation, financial engineering, risk management, and as Dean, he's been thinking and writing about the structure and performance of education in business schools. He's been leading the charge on tackling world-scale problems at Oxford and is a big advocate for our program. So, Peter, welcome, and thank you very much.
So I'm going to sit here.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming out, as Atif said, on this chilly Saturday morning at 8:45, and I'm really appreciative of that. So, as a dean, I often talk about business as the engine of society, but where is that engine? It's inside cars, autonomously driven or not. It's inside trucks and lorries. It's inside trains. It's inside planes. It's inside ships. It's inside rockets. And what do those work on? Well, they run on roads and bridges, and they work with complicated systems in the background to make sure that the planes don't run into one another and the ships get to where they need to be and the rockets get to where they want to be. And then what kind of systems sit behind that? Obviously, you can see where I'm going with this. Often what we focus on is the end product in business. But behind that, and integral to the success of all economies and societies, are all the large projects that you worry about. And so that's why I'm particularly pleased at this school that we not only worry about traditional business and entrepreneurship, which are obviously the things that are currently trendy, but also spend a great deal of our time worrying about these large infrastructure projects and mega projects in the world that you not only live in, but you lead. In order to do that, we deliver a number of programs, and Atif's bio listed some of those programs, our Masters in Major Program Management offering, as well as our offering for the UK government, the Major Program Leadership Academy. I'm very proud of those programs, and perhaps you'll hear more about them over the course of the day. But where do they come from? They come from the ability and the insight and reflection, and Atif talked about the combination of reflection that comes from research and the deep interaction between practice and between scholarship. And that's why today is so important. Why? Because in order to do great research and to get new insights into topics and be forward-looking, you can't just sit in your office. And so therefore, getting us together, people who do scholarly work as well as people who are actually running real projects, and discussing what's going on and how it's going on and what might go on in the future, helps to set a research agenda that's incredibly important, timely, and as we think about the scale of infrastructure projects being discussed all across the globe, it couldn't be more relevant. And so this is an opportunity to align our thinking and maybe to set a few objectives for the future, objectives that I'd be proud if the school could carry out. So welcome. You're here not only to listen, but to work, to be part of a dialogue. Now, as you all know, Atif said that major programs are defined by one definition is more than $1 billion in terms of spend. They're big, expensive projects, and our little venture is an expensive one as well, and I'd like to thank the people who've made, the organizations that have made today possible. Our event partner, Bechtel, our platinum sponsors, Oracle, Jacobs, Clark Capital Partners, and PwC. I do sincerely thank all of you, because these kind of events, which bring us together and move this field forward, are important. There are other sponsors as well, and I think you will see them in your materials. Anyway, thank you to all for that. Now, we have a number of outstanding speakers and panelists today, and I'd like to begin by introducing our first speaker, who is Sir David Higgins. Oh, actually, those are some of our friends. Thank you very much. Sir David became chairman of Gatwick Airport about a year ago, the 1st of January 2017, and he's been non-executive chairman of High Speed 2, HS2, in this country since March 2014. And made strong progress in establishing an organization capable of commercializing construction in 2017. As chief executive of Network Rail, Sir David initiated a major reform program focusing on transparency, value for money, and accountability. He also served as the chief executive of the London 2012 Summer Olympic Delivery Authority. Perhaps, the Team GB's one of their highest points in the last, certainly since I've been here in the last 7 years. Establishing the organization and negotiating the overall budget with the Treasury, and led the commercial negotiations for Stratford City, London and Continental Railways, and Westfield. He's currently a director of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. Before this illustrious career, he was the managing director and group chief executive of the Lend-Lease Group. He's a fellow of both the Royal Academy of Engineering and the Institute of Civil Engineers. And with his experience in many sectors, in the transportation sector and with the Olympics in that sector, and real estate and property development, he brings to us this morning a tremendous wealth of experience that will get us started in amazing ways. With that, I'd like us all to welcome Sir David to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, and I'm delighted to be here today. I know later on Atif is going to give me a grilling on virtual versus physical infrastructure, but I think Peter made my case very well. So I think you're starting from a tough challenge there. It's an interesting topic that I've been set, which is the case to justify physical infrastructure. And my history, my background, it's sort of like asking me, am I going to start my day going to Cafe Nero every morning and sitting and reading the paper? Well, naturally, and therefore, am I going to be positive for the case of physical infrastructure? Of course, but it's a very valid question. It's one that's very topical at the moment in this country in terms of the competing demands to invest in that issue. And some of us are old enough in the room here to remember when video conferences first came out. And video conferences were going to change the world in the way we communicate. It was going to eliminate air travel, and those early days where you kept talking over the other person on the other end of the video conference, and there's static and stuff. And of course, that never emerged. Video conferences happened, but travel in all areas continued to accelerate, because what people realize is that face-to-face, serendipity, the need to interact and to exchange ideas is always critically important. Silicon Valley is Silicon Valley for lots of reasons. One of the reasons it works is the massive highway running right through Silicon Valley. It connects every single major business there, and the hotels and the venture capitalists meet all the time to swap ideas and change things. So there's no indication anywhere that the need for interaction of human activity, and why we're here today. You could have sat at home having your coffee and watching this entire performance on the internet, but you didn't. You made the effort of, on a cold morning, of turning up here today. So that's an interesting exercise. But the change is coming so rapidly. On Wednesday night, I went to the Brits, not to perform, unfortunately. Stormy got there first, but it was interesting looking at the performances and the Ed Sheeran won, I think it was the International Award of the Year. I just listened to the stats. So he was number one in 113 countries around the world. Think of it. You know, one album getting 113. He had the top 10 records in the top 10 hits in the UK top 40 all at one time, from 1 to 10 in one go. But the other thing that he had streaming of 6 billion and downloads of 11 billion of his album. 11 billion downloads, and yet he's been on a 2-year tour. And Elton John, at his grand old age of whatever, 72, has announced that he's retiring. He's going to finish performing. That'll be after a 2-year world tour starting next year, where he will go around the world. Adele did 200 concerts around the world. So live performance of music is more and more difficult to get into. Try getting into Glastonbury, unless you're a genius on the internet, you can't get tickets to a thing. It sells out in minutes. So more and more people realise that whether it be TED Talks or Adele or Ed Sheeran, human interaction is more important than ever. So where are we in terms of what I want to talk about today? I want to talk about today really about the major project I've been involved in the last 4.5 years, and the majority of my workforce working life in that period has been what we call HS2. How many people here are UK based? Oh, surely you've heard of it all. But for those that haven't, we have a archaic Victorian railway system here, which is one of the most dense in the world and one of the highest growth in the world. That really relies on the case that we live in a very dense island and we operate a very services-based economy where people need to move around to get employment as we've moved from heavy manufacturing into a services-based economy. But we have one of the oldest and most complicated and most expensive railway systems in the world, because we basically have a 170-year-old Victorian network. I know it well. I ran it for 3 years. Toughest job I ever did from a safety point of view of trying to ensure the 20,000 trains every day performed and operated safely. But the capacity issue, the constraints of the system as I watched it, convinced me there was only one thing, that we needed to move into the modern world and build a dedicated high-speed consumer other than mixed use, so rather than freight and mixed high-speed capacity for public to move around the country. And so 4.5 years ago, I started on that exercise, but all the whole way through, we faced huge challenges. Why £60 billion in a time when there's a budget deficit and there's huge pressure on giving money to the NHS and other very worthy causes? So what justifies this case? So we always have to go back and rebuild the business case and justify why it's important to have a high-speed rail in this country. So we produced a document. I wrote it along with a friend of mine and launched it towards the end of last year. Here it is here. And this was, getting the best out of Britain, getting the best out of HS2. And we wanted to, I'd done papers on the strategy of why high speed and what was the line of route and the development opportunities came from it. But I wanted to address it from an economic point of view for the country. And what I looked at is the whole issue of productivity in the country. And you've heard a lot about the productivity gap. Many of our regional cities, compared to their European counterparts, are poor in terms of productivity. Our productivity in the UK is lower than the productivity in France, for example, as a nation. So why is there this challenge in terms of a productivity challenge? And the argument being put forward all along has been that, well, the Midlands and the North, where you have this productivity deficit, doesn't have the right skills. There aren't the right people, the right level of training. It starts right from primary through secondary school. We're not producing the right graduates. Our universities are not top standard universities. The research and development in the region isn't as strong as it is in Cambridge or Oxford or in parts of Germany or southern France, so of course America. So that's always been the case. So your way to solve it is apprentice programs or better programs on STEM subjects. So we wanted to analyse all that, and we spent a year going around the country, having workshops within different areas, talking to universities, local authorities, communities, and documenting it. And this book was the result. And who's the audience? Well, the audience is really the suppose when you combine it with the Lords, the 1,400 politicians that live in Westminster, that's the primary audience. Secondly, it's the general public. And what they said is, it's not an issue of skills. We proved it. Newcastle has some of the most highly sophisticated, well-skilled graduates working as baristas in coffee shops in the country. There's no problem in terms of the production of skilled technical students. Our universities, if you look at the universities, great universities of Birmingham or the M62 corridor, these are top-class universities. They're world-class compared to their European competitors in that area there. So it's not a matter that our universities in the Midlands and the North are substandard. And then finally, we looked at the whole issue of research and development. And we picked two industries. We picked the automotive industry and we picked the airline industry, and we documented where research and development carried out in this country. And what was really interesting is that it comes on the Y, so the high-speed rail starts in London, Euston of course, goes via Old Oak Common in West London to Birmingham, but then branches off east to Leeds via Nottingham and Yorkshire, and then on to York and eventually Newcastle, and west of course via Crewe, and then from Crewe onto Manchester, and then north to Preston. And what it showed is that R&D in both those industries was clustered around that Y. If you look at the area from Solihull through Nottingham, Derby, centre of Rolls-Royce, right through to the advanced manufacturing facilities in Rotherham, eventually to Darlington, you see there's massive investment of high-tech engineering technology, and equally on the western side, a big investment in aerospace. So that wasn't the issue. It wasn't about skills, it wasn't about quality of universities, and it certainly wasn't about R&D capability. That wasn't the issue. And what came back again and again is this issue of connectivity. And it's not just capacity, it's resilience and reliability, and it's an issue of speed. On Thursday it was, after a late night down at O2, I set off on a journey. I wanted to meet local authorities and business people in Preston, Lancashire, Liverpool, Nottingham, and then back to London again, which I achieved. So that was 9 hours on trains and 4 intense meetings carried out over 4 hours. I mean, it's just crazy in terms of trying to get around the country, really only covering cities that are a little bit over 100 miles away. So that was the case. We put this case to government, and we continue to do that. And I remind all the local authorities and politicians in the area that that's a case we're going to constantly have to make to justify the enormous investment in this area there. Let me see where I've got up to in the speech, which I spent all this careful time working up there. But it is a constant challenge of how you can justify the 50 billion investment. But what is really encouraging is that if you looked at this debate 4 years ago and you went to cities like particularly Leeds or places like Crewe, they weren't engaged and they weren't really interested, and they didn't see why this level of investment of a centrally imposed, technology-driven solution was for them. It was something that originated out of Westminster and Whitehall, was imposed on these communities, and it was really a project that was driven by very, very well-meaning, competent engineers, but it was about technology for technology's sake. It was, we need a high-speed railway network because others have it, and given that we're British, we want to be better. So we want it to be faster than any other train system in the world, 400 kilometres an hour. We want it to have greater capacity and load factors than any other rail system in the world, and high densities and high utilisation than any other system in the world. And naturally, have to have all the best technology. And everyone said, 50 billion to save 20 minutes to go to Birmingham? Well, that's a cup of coffee. Just give me Wi-Fi on the trains and save me 50 billion. And it was a compelling argument because no one had asked the question, why? If you're doing all this just to save 20 minutes, surely there's another way of getting that effectiveness in terms of GDP and growth. And the argument was clear. If you could get really efficient broadband and enough seats on the trains, then you sure as hell wouldn't spend that money just to save 20 minutes. So we had to go back to scratch and revisit the whole reason of why we were doing it. What was the purpose of building this national network through the country? So that was the exercise we embarked on some 4 years ago, and we realised this whole issue of the overheated south, the ineffectiveness of having a city in London where it's really unaffordable for many people and many jobs to live there nowadays, particularly anyone that works in the service sector, particularly the public service sector. It's very, very difficult for them to ever afford a house. So overheated south, underperforming north, and this huge, and what's more, continuing to go the wrong way. And whether it be the votes of Brexit or Donald Trump in America, you see this backlash from people that feel left out from the growth in wealth that technology advances have delivered to this country, and all the good things we see in wealth creation as the world's become more efficient. This has tended to cluster around the rich, highly developed, highly connected cities. So that's been the challenge all along to justify why what we're doing will start to address this whole issue of a north-south divide. So it wasn't a question whether it was technically possible to build a railway through a very flat, very straight railway through a green and pleasant land. It was much more an issue of why are we doing this? What's the purpose, and why should we as regional authorities, where we could much better spend the money putting a tram system in Leeds or fixing up connectivity across the Midlands, rather than have this drain pipe to London, a very effective high-capacity drain pipe which just suck more and more resources into London. So the argument we put was to develop that area there. And I think given that this is a primarily UK-centric audience, I spend a lot of time in Australia. I spend 7 trips a year out there. I sit on a advisory panel for Sydney University. Their equivalent, well, it's not of the scale and quality yet of what we have here in Oxford, of a projects campus. But I've witnessed in the last 5 years an extraordinary change in Australia and the decision by politicians to invest in public infrastructure. It's traditionally been an infrastructure market where the government have outsourced it to the private sector through toll roads. Some have been successful, some haven't. And then you've had this huge resources boom of gas and iron ore, but particularly liquid natural gas, and huge trains, as they call them, which convert this gas into liquid to export offshore. So Australia becomes the world's biggest exporter of natural gas, overtaking Qatar, but at the expense of investment in infrastructure. So the cities became completely clogged and incredibly difficult, and similar to London, a hothouse effect on real estate, where the very rich speculated to the expense of people that couldn't get access to the cities. Now there's been this overwhelming change in the country where they've realised that with a very, very low debt to GDP ratio, the governments can borrow and use their capital as seed capital and then recycle that and invest in infrastructure. So you're witnessing now the biggest investment in infrastructure in history. I look at the economic charts on them out there, and it shows the graph of resource investment into resource companies, and that does this over a 15-year period. And then you look at the infrastructure, and it does that. It's double the investment that ever happened in the resources boom, which was a massive level of capital investment in the country. There's $100 billion worth of infrastructure funded publicly currently underway in Sydney alone, just to put a size and scale on it. So that puts a massive challenge to our industry. And as always, as has happened here, the usual spikes happen. Scarcity of everything from bricks to raw materials, right through to the talented engineers and programmers and planners. And I think the massive challenge for our industry is we are still a very traditional industry. We still do things by traditional modelling and programming and scheduling and cost planning. I started in this industry, it's scary, 40 years ago. I started in Chesterfield, working in the UK, and I could honestly go back on construction sites and still survive. It's scary, isn't it? I could still survive with the technology I learnt in those days and still be an effective site engineer. Hopeless. So we're not an industry that uses evidence-based to analyse decision-making, to work out from a benchmarking and decision-making what should cost is and where the inefficient decisions are, predict those and the way forward, and yet other industries are way ahead of us on that. You just look at the health industry, as challenging as you may think it is sometimes when you read the newspapers, their use of evidence-based medicine and analysis and data networks is way ahead of our industry, as many others are. So it's an enormous opportunity for our industry to use the benchmarking and data that exists and is fragmented at the moment to do better prediction of costs of planning and decision makings. Which decisions do we take, which cost money, which bring in efficiency into our industry, and then how can we become better in terms of making decisions. So in overall summary, am I an advocate for major capital infrastructure? Of course, it's never either or. It's never broadband or high-speed rail. It has to be both. You have to analyse why you're doing something. What's the purpose of it? Where does it fit in the overall economic wealth? You have to engage with the community to explain to them so they have ownership of everything we do. And then as an industry, we have to use modern technology, which started with video conferencing, to make the decision-making in our project origination and project delivery and management and asset management far more effective than it is today, because we're still in the dark ages. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sir David. Wasn't that fascinating? I found it very thought-provoking, and it's interesting to see the case for big capital projects through the lens of HS2, and actually how they can foster connectivity and the asymmetry of the benefits case from the perspective of an individual citizen, and both at regional and at a national government level. Now, before I invite Atif to provide a response, I just wanted to take a moment to introduce myself. So my name's Elaine Heslop, and I'm the Director of the Custom Executive Education work that we do here in Oxford. I'm very proud of the work we do with the Cabinet Office around major project leadership because of the public value it creates and the opportunity to provide executive education that creates impact at scale. So Atif, if you would like to provide a response. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir David. Thank you, Elaine. My talk is going to be called Scaling 4.0, Why Major Programs Need a Technology Revolution. And let me, first of all, welcome you to Oxford. We're very proud of our 800-year-old university, but we're equally proud of the fact that despite the traditions, we're incredibly innovative. And Oxford has a tremendous technology spin-out scene, which has skyrocketed in recent years. And we're also very pleased that Oxford Science Innovation have also come on board to support the conference. So in many ways, this is to spur conversations about bringing technology into major programs. What I'll show you is that construction industry is desperately antiquated. And there's no point doing very large capital projects in this desperately antiquated industry. It needs a mass-scale technology revolution before taking on massive challenges. Oxford, as a result of its research and teaching, is now ranked world's #1 university. Cambridge came in second this year. Well done to them. A couple of, Peter Tufano and Elaine have mentioned our courses here. If you're interested in building your capability, Oxford offers 2 flagship courses. The MSc in Major Program Management. It's a 2-year master's program accredited at the university for mid-career professionals. We'd be delighted to hear from you if you'd like to join the course. We're equally proud of our partnership with UK Cabinet Office around the Major Budgets Leadership Academy. And if you're here from other governments of the world and would like to talk to us about the UK experience, we'd love to talk to you about that. So definitely, it's an industry that needs more capability building. First, before I give you some of the depressing news, since it's a cold Saturday morning, let me tell you a little bit about the opportunity, which builds on Sir David's point around the massive investment boom taking place in the industry at the moment. So the opportunity is getting big investments right does create a lot of prosperity. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with what this might be. Any shouts on what city we're looking at? Dubai. So only about 18 years ago, this patch of Dubai was a desert. Now, every single vertical line in the picture below is a several £100 million major program. And a huge sequence of them has been delivered over the years, which has unleashed tremendous creativity and excitement and dynamism in a patch of desert. And similarly, we can see Singapore doing the same thing. So the black and white picture is a colonial backwater in 1970s. You don't see any skyscrapers in the background, and the port looks like it could be from the late 19th century. Today, Singapore is the world's highest capita GDP country in the world, and it's because of getting a sequence of investments right in major programs. You see all those skyscrapers in the background, a tremendously dynamic, business-friendly city, and one of the world's most bustling ports and infrastructure that goes with it. So the case for getting infrastructure in major programs right is amply illustrated by examples like this. And major programs are big business. According to G20's Global Infrastructure Hub, nearly $94 trillion, more than the entire GDP of the world, needs to be spent on infrastructure between now and 2040. In my estimate, they are at least 10 times wrong on that number. So I will show you why that number needs to come down to 9.4 trillion for us to be able to get the benefits of the infrastructure reliably. At the moment, the current global market for infrastructure major programs is at least $2.5 trillion. It's a massive industry with huge amount of opportunity. And China is a case in point. China poured more concrete than the US did in all of 20th century in just 3 years between 2011 and 2013. It's an astounding number and suggests a tremendous mobilization capacity that the country has, and now is doubling down on it with a $1 trillion One Belt, One Road initiative that is going to build huge amounts of infrastructure around the world. So there's tremendous competition for infrastructure and also tremendous opportunity in that space. It is, and this is the last piece of good news, it is a good time. It is a good time to build major programs. Money is super cheap. It's cheaper than it was in Babylon 5,000 years ago. Energy is cheap. Commodities are cheap. Copper, steel, iron ores, the things that go into major programs are easily accessible. There's slack in labor supply, labor value chains, and labor is available. And overall, there's slack in global supply chains to be able to service that large infrastructure. And here I'd like to move to the fine print. All of this works, this happy world works, if the delivery works. And that's a big if. The challenge is major programs have simply a very poor track record of delivery. The hard evidence that we have collected at Oxford among several colleagues over the last 10 years suggests that cost overruns, time overruns, and benefit shortfalls are like maternal love. No matter what country you're in, you'll receive it in equal amount. And every asset class suffers from it. So roads, in a way, get off the best, with average cost overruns of 25%. Olympics have the dubious honor of always coming over budget, to the tune of 156%, and benefit shortfalls in rail projects of up to negative 51%. So half the riders you thought that are going to show up never turn up. So delivering capacity ahead of demand rings hollow when many of those benefits are not going to materialize. And technology often erodes that benefit profile. So it's a point of debate with Sir David later today during the Q&A. I must say, as much of a technologist as I am, IT programs don't fare particularly well either. So I would like us to be sober about the fact. So although my argument is for greater integration of technology, the path to integrating technology ain't easy. 1 in 5 technology major programs have the potential to bankrupt your company or sink your public sector organization. And we'll be discussing that later today as well. So this is a sobering reality about the difficulties of executing great ambitions, and why we need very honest conversations in gatherings like this to be able to improve the execution of our ambitions. Major programs are simply too slow. I've sampled a particularly extreme example of Tennessee Valley Authority, which took nearly 40 years to start a nuclear power project. The commission in 2015, as far as I'm aware, is still not running. And if I were a betting man, I would suggest that it's never going to flow electricity, although they've been making quite a few announcements. And the basic problem with that is there's a massive temporal mismatch when people need a service and when it actually appears. So even if you desperately need connectivity between London and Birmingham today, HS2, you'll be touching retirement by the time it appears. So it's almost pointless to try and build projects that take such long periods of time to come about. Moreover, there's difficulties in capital recovery, what we call investment fragility, and it leads to stranded assets, assets that do not pay back. Over half the dams we looked at had such large cost overruns that no matter their benefits, it was very difficult for them to recover their initial costs. And that turns into a debt hangman. It's not, particularly in developing countries or smaller balance sheets. So sinks companies with relatively small balance sheets. And we're seeing that in contractors. So even though Carillion was the second largest construction company in the UK, it could not absorb wobbles on a few of its major projects. And that can happen at a country scale as well. And we'll see more of that. I would even venture to make a prediction that most of the construction companies active in 21st century today may not survive this century because of insolvencies related to their major projects. So the state is one of very sad major programs. And Fukushima nuclear power plant in Japan is a classic example. So what this sad diagram, which is also known as the Jensen asymmetry, shows that the Fukushima nuclear power plant had a finite limit on its benefits. No random event could make it produce 10 times the electricity it was designed for. But only one random event made it not only lose its ability to produce any electricity, it caused massive havoc with inherited fragility through the system, and those cleanup costs are to the tune of $250 billion and counting. And as a result, it looks like a very unhappy frown. So that's the payoff structure. Finite gains, infinite pains. That's your typical major program. Our task is happy major programs, right? And that's what technology promises. Finite pains with very firm floors to the negative payoffs, but really no limit to the positive payoffs. And the trick for us is to try and understand, how do we get to that happy world where we can limit the pain, but not limit the potential gain? So our vision at Oxford is what my colleague Ben Freiberg calls the iron law of major programs, which are over budget, over time, under benefits over and over again, is to turn them to on time, on budget, to benefits every time, because of Oxford and our partners. So we are delighted. And it is a scaling problem. We want this message to go to everybody in the world, and it would take several lifetimes work to achieve that. So major programs need a technology revolution. And let me paint a picture for what that might look like. First of all, as Sir David Higgins mentioned as well, there's a massive productivity problem in the country as a whole, and the world is suffering from it in general, but particularly in the construction sector. It is the only sector in the economy where labor productivity has actually declined. It's a message that jars with colleagues in the construction industry, but it's very difficult to argue with hard evidence. And obviously we can slice and dice the data in different ways, but the truth remains that agriculture has far outperformed construction, and that's something we need to address. Moreover, across any measure of digitization or technology, construction is bottom of the heap. In terms of petabytes of data construction companies store, it ranks the lowest in any sector of the economy. They simply haven't got a grounding of what they're dealing with. Almost everything is done on conjecture: cost, time, benefits, process flow. They don't have data, and it's all rules of thumb. And as a result, it's very difficult to manage manage these construction projects, not just at construction, but also through their asset lives. So we need to see that number of petabytes of data going up exponentially for this to change. Moreover, across other measures of digitization, for example, digital assets, whether or not workers have access to digital tools like iPads or sensors at work, construction is once again bottom of the heap. Even agriculture does better. And we could learn from more hip industries like ICT and media, which do a lot better in this. And you can see that their profitability, their market capitalizations broadly reflect the technology diffusion in those industries. So once again, across these measures, construction is a 19th century industry. It must leapfrog to the 21st century. And things like AI are just not known in the construction industry. People laugh when you talk about artificial intelligence. Whereas in the finance sector, where my brother works, essentially, unless you're using artificial intelligence, you are not competitive. You cannot trade. And that will also happen in construction in due course. Tech firms, on the other hand, are masters of scaling. From Amazon, Facebook, Google, to obviously our sponsor Oracle, they have done tremendously well in terms of scaling their revenues, number of employees, number of apps they produce, and it's breathtaking. Facebook was a mere startup in 2004. It now has a market capitalization of $500 billion. It could swallow most of the British construction company and have lots of change left once it's done so. And it's really done this in a breathtaking speed. Moreover, they're turning into construction companies. Facebook's been announcing a data center practically every quarter, and these are billion-dollar investments that they seem to deliver very efficiently. So there's much to learn from these companies with fast exponential growth. And the concept that I'd like to coin is called scaling 4.0. So, and here's something to think about. Over time, we've started with manual scaling, so this is highly artisanal production that only reached your village or local environment. We then moved to mechanical production, which one might call scaling 2.0, which improved the overall reach, but was still relatively low. Scaling 3.0 is electrical. Scaling 4.0 is digital and information-based, and that has the potential to reach 100% of the population, but also eventually make us a multi-planet society. Now, I don't mean this in a very freaky Elon Musk sort of way, but the fact of the matter is that we live in an age, particularly in construction, that straddles scaling 1.0 to scaling 3.0. And you'll be amazed by how many processes in construction are not even at scaling 3.0 yet. And as a result, the construction industry remains highly fragmented and highly localized, and certainly cannot get us to Mars. So if we were to build something on another planet, it does require transforming how we deliver this. And paradoxically, big and bespoke is not scalable because it has too much variety, and as a result, not enough volume. And scaling requires volume. And that requires us bringing down the variety in our mega projects so that they're less one-off and there's much greater repetitiveness or repeatability from one project to another. As we journey down from bespoke to continuous flow, it also unleashes learning. And that learning is embedded in the design of the programs. And I'll give you examples from the computing industry to that effect. And interestingly, boxes are very scalable. So this box is a shipping container, and much like the construction industry today, shipping looked like this back in the 1950s. Messy, manual, bespoke, not standardized. Lots of pulleys, lots of labor, and black and white. Construction's still black and white. And unsafe. Look at that car. It's unclear what is sat on and what's going on top of it, and whether either the car or whatever is sat on will survive the journey. And construction projects look a little bit like this if you've been to any construction site. So not much has changed. far too much labor is applied to doing tasks that could be done by cranes very easily, and other forms of technological innovation. This is what MMS looks like. That little dot in the bottom is a blue whale. These are cities floating on high seas. And the ship I showed you previously, SS Warrior, carried 5,000 tons. It took 10 days to load and unload. MMS loads 5,000 tons in 2 hours. That's a 99% improvement on the SS Warrior. So what we're seeing are orders of magnitude improvements across any measure. MMS is 99% faster, it's 90% cheaper, even after accounting for the billions of dollars spent in building all the associated infrastructure of containerized shipping. The construction industry similarly needs to be 10 times faster, 10 times cheaper, 10 times safer, 10 times better than it is today. Or just there's no point building these big projects until we get that. So we really need to figure out how to do that. And container shipping achieved that by the following transformations. What was bespoke was standardized and modularized. The continuous flows of freight was digitized. It was put in packets of containers. What was manual was automated with cranes. What was complex and messy was made simple. And what was fragmented was congealed together into a platform. And these basic principles of scaling apply to the construction industry as well. Moreover, we remain constrained in the construction industry by the triple constraint of scope, time, and cost. Technology busts these constraints. So once you introduce technology, it could deliver much greater scope, much more scope, but 10 times cheaper, 10 times faster. Computing is a classic example. Computers today, general purpose computers today, do far more tasks than computers did 40 years ago, and they do them at fraction of the time and cost they took back in the day. And so they bust these triple constraints. And similarly, the construction industry must also learn to escape these iron triangles. So allow me to give you a 3-part heuristic or rule of thumb for what this scaling transformation of big mega projects and major programs might look like. First is to modularize. On the top is System 360 of the IBM. It's the first modular computing system IBM designed. And this was in response to a system they built called Saïd in the 1950s. Saïd was a semi-automated defense system on which they had spent more than $10 billion in 1950s money. IBM, MIT, and the US Department of Defense had spent more money on Saïd than on the Manhattan Project. And it had built these massive 29 artisanal computers, concrete bunkers around the country, and there was a tremendous amount of advertisement done to promote it, which to modern audiences is hilarious. The thing never worked. And IBM knew that. So Tom Watson locked up his entire top management team in a warehouse in upstate New York, and much like the way we elect the Pope these days, he said, you guys are not coming out until you fix this mess. I'd like to do that with construction executives. Perhaps we are doing that today. And that mess entailed modularizing the computer from hundreds upon hundreds of non-standard components to 50 standardized components and peripherals. And it was a painful process. It went from 1957 to 1964, cost IBM about $5 billion back then, but then by 1980s, IBM was the world's largest and most profitable company. And today, almost every computer is a descendant of that System 360. Similarly, today, Katera, a company I'm studying in Silicon Valley, is trying to modularize apartments. It's raised about $250 million, and it's trying to do something quite similar in terms of taking all the hardware components that go into building residential real estate and coming up with standardized finite number of modules that can be interoperated over and over again in different projects and combined in different sorts of uses. Second is to digitize. That you might recognize is Guggenheim Bilbao in Spain and the architect Frank Gehry. And my colleague Ben Flyberg, as well as Del Cara, have done quite a bit of work looking at why a crazy building, which Frank Gehry's own words is a bit like falling spaghetti, could be delivered on time and on budget. Signature architecture, like the Guggenheim Bilbao, typically suffer cost overruns to the tune of 300%. Sydney Opera House had a cost overrun of 1,400%. That mad building came in 1% under budget. And the way they delivered it was through a high-fidelity building information model, which specified to a great degree what was to go into the building, and as a result, they could practically print off the construction because of the high-fidelity model, which they borrowed from the aircraft industry and automobile industry. And similarly, companies like Procore are introducing these technologies to digitize the entire life cycle, the entire end-to-end process of delivering construction by introducing these digital tools. So not much is left to chance, and a huge deal needs to be done. Gary's building also suggests that there is a way out of our current mess. These challenges are not insurmountable, but requires a lot more thought than we are putting in to our projects. Finally, is to automate. It takes big companies usually about a week to close their books on a monthly basis. Amazon closes them in 1 hour. And it closes them so quickly, it does a micro-close every day. And this is despite processing millions upon millions of relatively small transactions. Very hard accounting job. 80% of the transactions are automated, and this is not even using advanced AI yet. This is fairly basic stuff that is able to do that. Similarly, in the automobile industry, which has similarly reduced cost and improved scope, the robots applied per hour skyrocketed between 1990 and 2000. My colleague here at the business school, Matthias Hollweg's seminal book on automobile industry, shows how automation in the industry completely transformed it. Similarly, in construction, we need to apply a great deal more automation, both in terms of robotics, but also process automation to achieve that. And these are the various digital technologies that are changing this. And ladies and gentlemen, this is not bullshit bingo, which is how most people perceive blockchain, artificial, and it has turned into a bit of there's a degree of faddism around these things. There's I believe a company in New York that recently changed its name from the Long Island tea company to Long Blockchain. I might be getting my facts wrong. And its share price just skyrocketed based on that one fact alone. So I do want to advise against overindulgence. However, these technologies, from virtual reality to AI, are profoundly transforming the industry, so watch out. To conclude, before we conclude, I would like to have a point of debate with Sir David is, will autonomous vehicles and ultra-fast broadband make HS2 obsolete? And my sense is HS2 is worth building if it could be 10 times cheaper and faster. So if we could build it at 5 billion rather than 50 billion and deliver it next year, let's do it. And this is a picture of Churchill. This is a picture of Churchill laying bricks. And one of the things Victorians and early 20th century British construction got right, which is why we have so many beautiful pieces of construction then, was tremendous skill building in the industry and tremendous amount of competition. So Churchill himself was a master builder in terms of bricklaying. We need to force the industry into a similar competition to really drive out those 10x improvements across the board. So to conclude, construction major program outcomes are crummy. Incremental innovation is not going to cut it. We need radical scaling 4.0 innovation. The elements of this revolution are threefold: modularize, digitize, automate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Atif. If we accept Sir David's case of the benefits of the big capital projects, as an Atif says, there is much to get right if we're going to get beyond the maxim of finite gains and infinite pain. And I think you've had a very helpful framework in telling us how to do this. I think to kick the Q&A off, and I really would like it to be lively, I suppose my starting question for you both is the industry capable of it? Because we really do have to start by talking about Carillion. Like, are these organisations capable of making the transformation to deliver the benefits case that you've so passionately spoken about? So, David, I'm going to invite you to respond first.
Well, I think we know that our industry is undercapitalized, sporadic, short-term focus, no investment in long-term skills, low margin, poor balance sheets, and we're not global in scale. So one of the things we did when we tendered for HS2 for the main works contractors, we said, don't come as a British contracting company, bring Big Brother, because the international companies have 10 times the turnover you have a lot more in-house staff and capability, design, they have knowledge banks and everything else. Go away, partner up with someone, learn from them and come back, and then we'll agree with you. So we did appoint Carillion, but we appointed them with 2 other major companies, and we appointed them on a joint and several unincorporated company structures, so that, not that we predicted they would go broke, when they fell over, that we weren't impacted. But yeah, our industry is really poorly served. It's poorly served by client decision making, and it's poorly served by the capital markets. Client decision making, number one problem.
Okay, so it's the clients, not the organisations.
It's short-term decisions. I mean, we're building more rolling stock than we have in history, and yet for 15 years we did nothing. We didn't electrify the railway lines for 25 years. We lost all skills completely, and then we embark on a massive electrification program. We wonder why we run into problems. It's crazy.
Atif, what's your take on it?
So if I could rephrase your question, it is whether an existing construction company can transform the industry, or whether change would come outside, like Tesla is trying to do with the automobile industry, or SpaceX has done in the space industry. And I think the balance of evidence suggests that change will come from the outside, that it will be a highly disruptive, well-funded challenger that will disrupt the industry. However, there are instances where incumbents have transformed, but it's a very disciplined process. IBM is a case in point. So IBM was doing very poorly in late 1950s. It had been the world's largest computer manufacturer pretty much from the early 20th century, but because of a number of major programs gone wrong, largely the Saïd system, by 1950s, the company was going nowhere. And it took a huge amount of leadership. So Tom Watson back then, as I mentioned, essentially asked all his executives to hit pause on everything. They were not allowed to build any more projects. And said, look, you guys have to all go into this warehouse and redesign this, and we're going to kill everything we've done before. So incredibly forceful decision to say, we're literally going to cannibalize the old IBM and start from scratch again. So bet the company. And I do wonder if there is a big construction company out there that is willing to make that bet and say, the way we've done business for the last 100 years, it's just not going to work. We're going to hit the pause button, not take on any more contracts for a couple of years, use our excess cash and our balance sheet to completely transform the industry, modularize, digitize, automate.
Fantastic. Straightforward then. So opening it up to the floor and inviting you to ask a question, please could you tell me who you are, where you're from as well. So questions, please.
Hello, so Daniel Copelson from Millennium, a former MMPM alumni. Isn't there, as I say this as a technology professional, scaling technology is quite difficult, and very few companies have actually do that successfully. And while there are some major success stories, a lot of software development is still pretty artisanal, bespoke, has a lot of the similar challenges to the construction industry in many ways, but arguably without some of the professional standards. And if you look beneath the covers, yeah, a lot of it's pretty ugly still. Do you think there's a kind of danger in this almost potential fetishization that technology might be the answer, but I think there's still a lot of development that needs to happen in developing good practice before just thinking that actually it might be a magic bullet and there's good lessons to learn.
Atif.
So I agree with you that technology outcomes, particularly bespoke technology systems, are just as crummy as construction and has similar issues, if not more, of highly manual artisanal work. And it can be highly dependent upon key workers, gilding away on particular bits of code, a bit like Masons did back in the day. So completely agree with the challenge. My sense is that there are similar techniques. So Facebook, Google, etc., they all use the same kernel of Linux to then build out these platforms. So it's very scalable, highly modular software systems that they have assembled over time. So if we try and do too much innovation and too much over-tinkering of technology in construction, I don't think technology will yield any productivity gains. On the other hand, if we could similarly come up with platforms like a Linux or Unix that can serve the industry in the background, we may have better luck with it. Now, the difficulty with that is it's very hard to make money out of it. So somebody has to give that kernel away. In the shipping industry, that was patents on the fittings of the containers. So Malcolm McLean and Sealand had those patents, and they held on to them for nearly 10 years with the hope that as those patents scale, they'll become very, very rich. But Malcolm McLean realized that unless he releases those patents, the industry was simply not going to scale. So part of this is to convince venture capitalists to give up greed and put a lot of patents out around those initial kernels. And Tesla has released most of its patents now, which I think is a tremendous step in the right direction. We need that to happen both on technology side, but also in the basic bits of the modules that we create that are reusable across the industry.
The notion of giving up greed doesn't add to my optimism, Atif. So David.
It'd be interesting if you look at apartment development. I advise a private equity company who are building 7,000 apartments over 7 or 8 years at one location here in London. And I go out regularly to talk to the designers and the delivery team. If you said 10 years ago that everyone would have bathroom pods delivering, let's say mad, too expensive. So this project, everything is delivered in bathroom pods. They're all made in Italy. They're shipped across, and you think, how could that possibly be viable? Only one out of those 10,000 pods plus has had any technical faults on it because of a lifting bar didn't quite decompressed it. So no one would ever build a bathroom on site anymore in any apartment developments. Volumetrics will have to come in apartments. I mean, the idea of sitting there and having lots of workforce pouring concrete or assembling mechanical work on site with weather and all those problems of access, in 20 years' time, that's not going to happen. Everything's going to be prepackaged, tested in a remote factory, and brought onto the project and plugged in. So I think it will progressively work like that, but I think so much of it is in the concept and design, and the issues of standardization will come to our industry for sure.
Thank you. Let's take another question, please.
So it's Jonathan Norman from the Major Projects Association. So David, you talked about the initial skepticism of cities like Birmingham and Crewe and others in HS2, and I think both of you talked about this division between the haves and the have-nots and the alienation that exists in certain parts of the population. And I wondered, if we're going to make these revolutions in technology and revolutions in construction, how do we bring that part of the UK with us so that we don't just increase the divisions rather than decrease them?
What you work out is that it's not difficult to work out technically what to do. By far the most complicated process is engagement and gaining ownership. And that's a case of giving away control. So we went to Leeds 4 years ago. They weren't interested in high speed, but they wanted a tram. And we talked to them about their level of ability to compete and their loss of skills. We did a study on the graduates between 25 and 35 and how many of those were leaving the Midlands and the North and going to Greater South East. It was staggering and scary for them. And so in the end we said, what's wrong with this scheme? And they said, we weren't asked, it was imposed, we'd like to change it. And we said, have a workshop, change it. We'll engage and we'll listen. And we changed the whole scheme to suit their local needs. They've come up with a huge master plan for the south of the city. It's much better. So getting local ownership is super important. So I mean, Birmingham, I heard an interesting stat the other day. The major teaching hospital in the centre of Birmingham was complaining. They said it's now unsafe to bring the helicopters into the roof of their major teaching hospital because there's so many tower cranes operating in central Birmingham. I said, well, that's good from my point of view. I know you've got a problem. But I mean, Birmingham has a much greater growth rate now than London, which is interesting, isn't it? But you go up to Birmingham and tell them the story, they've all got it. The politicians, even the local businesses and that, they see their level of investment. It's a long and continuous process of public ownership and engagement. You can't fight that.
Thank you. Let's take another question, please.
Hello, it's Kaushik Pramanik, former executive education student, alumni. I have a question for Atif. What is your view on impact of fintech evolution in the program management? How it is going to impact the way we do the program management and in large-scale project programs and our small-scale programs? How it is going to impact?
Absolutely. So, part of my advisory work is with CFO teams, and that's actually been the reason I've been pulled into technology. So a lot of major programs obviously have a lot of financial and fiduciary flows, payments. Using bits of blockchain will be able to make this much easier. So small vendors wouldn't have to wait 60 days for the invoices to be paid. They'll be paid the minute they've delivered the work. Similarly, we're seeing transaction costs come down rapidly. So the whole sort of process and back office of financial management of major programs is where a lot of that technology could get embedded. And I think artificial intelligence and automation of those processes and blockchain is where a lot of that revolution is happening. AI is the farthest along, alongside use of kind of robots to reconcile statements, close books, et cetera, but we haven't yet quite seen payments taking off. In due course, of course, experiments in fintech could really be absorbed into major programs. So for example, you could use blockchain for contracts to maintain contract integrity. You could similarly use blockchain for ensuring transparency and collaboration around design, so that design became immutable across the designers and the construction teams. But we are some ways away from that.
Thank you. Please can we take the microphones wider and turn the volume up as well? Can I invite more Q&A? Sir?
Yes. Is this on? Martin Blakelock. I'm an infrastructure project finance banker by background. If you look at the background for the decision makers for UK's major capital projects, in other words, look at the 26 ministers and junior ministers in charge of transport, energy, environment, education and health in the UK, then there is only one who has a scientific university qualification. Do you think this is a hindrance or help to the development of technology in infrastructure?
Sir David.
Which one is that? I don't know. I don't think I've met him anyway, or her, who knows. It is a great indictment, really, of our industry and our system, isn't it? I mean, whether you look at the Lords as well, I mean, there's very few engineers in politics, full stop, and rational decision-making. And the other challenge is just the constant change. We've had relative stability, but for the period, there were 5 transport ministers in 6 years. So, it is a massive challenge of bringing ministers up to speed and getting continuity. We do, I've worked with some fantastic secretaries of state that give continuity and delegate decision making, but it's a constant changing. I mean, you wonder why Singapore and Dubai work. I mean, because they bring very professional people into political roles to make these decisions.
If I may add, and completely agree, contrast this to the Standing Committee of the Politburo in China. I struggle to think of a single member of that Standing Committee of the last 20 years who was not an engineer. And you can sort of see where that gap is going.
I think there's also an interesting perspective that maybe it's not just about the background in terms of being an engineer, but what you spoke to, Sir David, is also about the leadership challenge around this and about empowerment and delegating decision making. And that's quite significant when we look at these major capital projects. More questions, please.
Good morning. This is Ajay Kapoor. I'll take this opportunity to ask a question from Sir David. So, in my personal view, in 1995, if we would have thought of connecting cities, I would have gone for a high-speed railway. I would have bought that idea. Probably in 2000 as well. But while in Dubai we're talking about drone taxis, in US we're talking about, Elon Musk ideas of under the earth high-speed systems. Should we be spending this money on HS2, or should we be looking at things like drone taxis, which can connect cities better, something of that sort? Because we are solving the problem with the solution we would have used like 10, 15, 20 years back.
Yeah, we are very, very late into this debate. The whole idea of having a 170-year-old railway line with 12 different railway companies doing entirely different things, some freight, some commuter services, some high speed, all travelling at different speeds, owned by different companies to varying timetables, is bizarre. It's why we have highest cost railway in Europe, because we have what's called mixed use railway. So most other countries in the world, certainly all of Europe, a long, long time ago decided you need to segregate to get proper utilisation and efficiency of connectivity. To the argument of why should we spend money on HS2, I ran the national railway system only for 3 years, but I spent a lot of time looking at what we did, and it was just complete frustration at catch-up. You know, we'll spend more in the next 10 years patching up the existing railway with no great improvement in overall productivity, just to stand still, than we were on HS2. The great tragedy is that we spent £10 billion patching up West Coast, and we still have very, very poor performance of it to get marginal increase. If we'd spent that $10 billion starting 15 years ago, when they started it on what was called West Coast route modernisation on the high-speed line, it would be finished by now. So my argument is, Crossrail is 20 years late, Thameslink is 20 years late, High Speed 2 is at least 20 years late. So yeah, we are way behind. Will modular cars, self-driving cars solve it? Well, last time I checked on the M25 or the M1, it didn't matter whether they were robotic drive or self-drive, it was still a massive traffic jam. So the problem is, the problem is getting around. I've just decided, it's a nightmare driving in and around the southeast, but you think it's bad? Try the M6. So right from Preston south to Wolverhampton, most afternoons, it's basically bumper to bumper the whole time. It doesn't matter if those cars are automated or if they're 10 metres apart instead of 20, it'll still be a massive traffic jam, and you can't get the distances that we can get with high speed and high capacity. Will we use modular self-drive versions of Uber to get us to these stations? Absolutely right. Try getting a drop-off point to King's Cross Station or Paddington today if you're a private individual, or if you're Uber. It's literally impossible. But the interchanges we built in the future must be designed, in my mind, much more for high-capacity drop-off points that get people right into the heart of cities very quick with very high capacity. That's the future. And we should have built a high-speed spine network generation ago. We're in catch-up mode.
And you don't see the value in drone taxis or one of these new technologies that have come up?
We absolutely. We should have road pricing. That's one of these debates. Why don't we have proper demand management and road pricing in this country? Otherwise, the roads are really going to be completely jammed up, but politically it's incredibly difficult. When you do that, you'll then get much greater utilisation of getting people off the road. So people in Manchester interchange, just near the airport, should then be able to get in a train and get to Old Oak Common in less than an hour. That's what they'll do. If they try driving, even at 60 miles an hour, it'll still take them 3 hours. So we need to make sure that people can get to these huge high-capacity interchanges very, very efficiently on remote vehicles, modules, pods, whatever we call them. I think it's fully integrated with a very high-capacity, fast spine through the country.
So really your point is about the integration of
Correct.
some of these older legacy
Absolutely right.
solutions
Yep.
with the new ideas. Atif, what's your perspective on this?
So in interest of nuance, allow me to argue against myself for one quick second. So Nassim Taleb, one of our colleagues, has this notion that time is the greatest filter for fragility. So whatever time doesn't break persists. Now, railways and high-speed railways have persisted for nearly a century. So the condition probability of them persisting yet longer is very high. And as a result, we have to be a little bit circumspect of too much crazy stuff. So, because time hasn't applied its force on it yet. So we've been walking for a lot longer in human time or geological time than we'll be riding bicycles. So all bicycles may be gone, but human beings will still have the ability to walk, to move around. So rail transport remains, because of that, because it has sustained time for considerable time, nearly 3 centuries, for at least another 3 centuries. So I'm in agreement that we need to build these interchanges, we need to build these railways. But my disagreement is on the how. And at current cost structures, at current time structures, I don't see how they're viable. So, absolutely, we should lay out these rights of way, which are very difficult to assemble, but once they have been assembled, live on for centuries. And as a result, it's great for us to push through those political debates, but it's the technology of how the construction happens, which is where we're debating.
So the whole debate on that is about how you do it. I drove up on the M40 this morning early from London, and I thought, we'd never get the M40 approved today. It would never be built. That massive cutting as you come through the you would never get, look at the scar of the countryside that it would have created. So when you travel on high speed 1, I mean, it's not for public comment, but the section of Birmingham, you'll very rarely see any of the countryside at all. It's buried. 50 miles of tunnels, and the rest of it's buried in a trench. And that's political. That's entirely politics. It was 2,500 petitions, 3 years in the Commons in debates, and that was very, very fast compared to Crossrail. 15 years to get Terminal 5. This is where the costs come in. It's the decision-making process that you don't have in Singapore or Dubai or China or France. So that's the cost of inefficiency and decision-making. It is we have to, when we're building Euston, or just let the huge development contract, we have to set out in a 50,000-page legal documentation how are we going to build entire Euston. We have to say where the trucks are going to go in 10 years' time. We have to describe the level of noise and dust those trucks will generate in 10 years' time of how we're building a station. We haven't got any idea today how we intend to build it. But we had to do that, and if we breach that legal envelope in any element, from area to dust to noise, we breach the undertakings. And we have 40,000 undertakings just in phase 1 that we have to legally comply with, from relocating badges to not making noise in Euston. That's the cost. Doesn't happen in many other parts of the world, but we want to have our right of democracy, and fair enough. But that we should understand, we could build a very efficient railway. We could build it at at least a third cheaper if we built it to straight international standards, and we weren't building it in a green and pleasant land.
So are we really saying then that democracy sits in tension with the delivery of these major projects, do you think?
Of course. But democracy and engagement makes things long-term ownership, and I never want to trade democracy or freedom of press or challenge to process. It's really, really important. But we do pay a price in terms of productivity. When you show those photographs of Dubai and what can be achieved there, or, I mean, Singapore, that port, Marina Bay Sands. Everyone been to Marina Bay Sands? That was a port. That was an open seawater port. They said, let's turn it into a freshwater lake and move the entire port over there and turn this into an entire new city. Well, 10 years later, it's all happened.
Fantastic, thank you. Let's go for some more questions.
So my name is Ville Helenius. I'm managing director of a company called Symbolites, and we do consulting mainly in the financial services. But I live in London, or just outside London, at the end of a very short stick of a southern railway line. And I just wanted to, obviously, I do work in the financial services, but is there any vision to fix this? I mean, it's not a very complex problem. I think that railway has been there since 1800 something. And when the railway starts failing, I was thinking about getting one of those pumping cars and driving myself to work. So, and what's the visionary way to fix London commuting? Because clearly drones don't work, cars don't work, Uber's being banned. How do you actually, what's the technology innovation that's actually going to fix this? Because, I mean, technically we've got 6 trains, I think, going through my station an hour, and it keeps failing for all sorts of random reasons. So how do we actually make London commuting work without actually putting it in a totalitarian government?
I can explain how you can solve Southern simply. So Southern Railways, combination of 3 different companies 150 years ago, fought with each other to get their railways quickest down to the south. And so the railway lines weave and cross all over each other on land, and they would be approving up to 50 bills a year through Parliament to create chaos and entrepreneurship, which built the railway system in that intense period. And so as you go on Southern Railway line, as you go East Croydon, there's something called Windmill Junction. Next time you go through there on the way to Gatwick, have a think about it. So this has 9 flat junctions. A flat junction is where one train is on a bit of track and another train has to cross that same bit of track. There are 9 different flat junctions at that point. We put a drone up there to try and convince people how fundamental the problem was, and trains come along, this one stops, then that one stops, and that one stops, and that one stops, and this one goes ahead, and that one goes ahead. And it takes 10 minutes or 5 minutes minimum to get through Windmill Junction. What you have to do in a modern railway is grade separate those junctions. That's what happened at Reading. Grade separate the freight lines from Southampton to avoid fouling the entire western railway systems coming into Reading, and expanded the station. East Croydon Station can expand. It can all happen. It's a relatively modest amount of money in terms of scheme of things to solve that. And when you solve that, you gain 20 years capacity on Southern. So one of my arguments as chair of Gatwick with the government, Department of Transport, is give us a little bit more flexibility, and we may even decide to invest in your railway system to solve a problem which is yours, to solve the access there. But the other thing is you have to do is traffic management. So the timetabling system for Southern is hopelessly complicated and old-fashioned, and artificial intelligence would design you a very efficient traffic management system to clean up the timetabling system on that line. Not difficult to solve, political will and a little bit of money, and will take 10 years, unfortunately.
And your point about only 10 years.
Approvals, 5 years of approvals.
Your point about the underpinning technologies is interesting, and Atif, I'm sure you'll have a perspective on that.
So I think, unfortunately, and this is perhaps a unique British problem as well, the Great British finesse, or what I prefer to call the Great British fudge, which is we have this tendency in our political system to just kind of try and over-optimize too much and try and achieve some form of an overall consensus, which leads to a bit of a spaghetti, unfortunately. And we now have spaghetti infrastructure, particularly in London. So part of that is, like Sir David suggested, just unraveling those knotty spaghettis, just cleaning them up a little bit. And that requires leadership. So before technology, the fix is leadership. And just somebody putting their foot down saying, enough of this mess, this dithering, we're going to clean this up, and this is what's going to look like. So there's not too much fudging. The second element of that is begin with basic process analysis and try and introduce very simple technologies to overcome biggest hurdles in that journey. So for example, since we've had the Marylebone train from Oxford to London, and because you can buy online tickets, it saves me heaps of time commuting to London because I don't have to buy a printed ticket and don't have to queue up to print a ticket. So very simple tools like a digital app to be able to purchase your ticket saves customers heaps of trouble. And we seem to have resistance against it. So one line has done it, the other line doesn't like it. Like the Great Western still resists it. And similar things could be done. So once you begin unraveling that spaghetti and then using very simple signaling digital technology, removing very old Victorian mechanical signals that we have in some places with latest technology to be able to achieve that. And I think we have to look to the north, Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands. They don't have these problems. They're also democracies. So it's not a problem with democracy, it's a problem with fudging.
Good.
Okay, hi, Yvonne Chavez. From Los Angeles, I'm about to be a recent graduate of the Major Program Management program. I started my career in construction in Los Angeles at the J. Paul Getty Museum. I spent the last 20 years in entertainment. I'm curious in regards to the mention of AI. Obviously, the motivation behind that would be to move all the mundane tasks, those that could be identified with volume and complexity, and automate those. And one thing that I've experienced in both industries is that, aside from the leadership mentions that you just suggested, is that there's a tremendous cultural barrier as well as user adoption acceptance. And so if we moved beyond your finite gain and infinite pain graph and gave some thought to, even if you had all of the funding, if we had everyone in place and we were able to deliver successfully, is there any thought in regards to retooling the human resources and to conveying these advances in technology to the mass public, so that there would be not only a cultural shift in the industry, but also a shift in the user adoption rate so that it is successful in examples that you gave, such as Denmark?
Yeah. Really important question. So technology does not diffuse easily and often doesn't get adopted. And I think many of my colleagues here who work in big enterprise systems will tell you that companies may spend millions of pounds buying licenses, but may not be able to get their colleagues actually using the service. So very, very hard. But then we also see there's some technologies that diffuse very quickly. So there were no iPhones in 2007, and now every phone looks like the iPhone or is the iPhone, right? And that took nearly just 10 years to go from a scale of 0 to a scale of 7.6 billion across the world. There are 1.2 billion iPhones, but all the other phones are basically iPhones. And so that, and they are very, people love them, right? So that I think, and hats off to Steve Jobs on that, technology required, it has to be really simple, really intuitive, and to go back to his third heuristic, it has to be friendly. So he made initial computers to look like human faces. And most technology is not friendly. So we have to spend quite a bit of time behaviorally being stupid simple about technology interfaces. And I think what often happens, we get so excited about the functionality, the back end, that we allow that functionality to become the interface. And that ruins it. So it's not to take away what the spine can do, but or the skeleton can do, but the face of that technology has to be very friendly, and the human interface has to be worked out very carefully.
Thank you. So David, your perspectives on, is HS2 going to be user-friendly? And how will we drive the adoption?
Yeah, I wanted to pick up that issue on technology, because I think it was something that Atif had said earlier on blockchain and design. I mean, let's face it, BIM and CAD, as utilised in our industry, is hopeless. It's so old-fashioned. We don't design anything like the 787. We should. Stockley Park is a series of business parks. The first one, built 30 years ago, had 1,000 drawings. The third stage had 10,000 drawings. It was still the same building. Unbelievably complicated. Blockchain, when I first heard it described to me, I thought, it's interesting. It's a general ledger. If you have a private label blockchain, it's perfect for construction industry of having a protocol that disciplines change control and then has a distributed user group from suppliers, manufacturers to the various specialty in design. So, and then finally to the user. I mean, why can't people walk into the building, the offices, the houses that they want to do virtually today? None of that technology is complicated. It's just we have such a basic process of design. It's so biblical. The tendering process, the procurement, the supply chain, the payment system, it's hopeless. Someone will change it. And I think it's probably going to be someone from outside. The only thing that's happened has been massive consolidation in the engineering consulting world now in the last 10 years. I mean, these huge organizations now, minimum 60,000 people in them. That scale, I think, will allow this level of investment to happen, which is sorely needed.
Okay. Fantastic. I'm going to take two more questions, please.
Hi, my name is Anfisa Bashkirova. I'm a current student of Major Program Management program. And my question is around public engagements. Do you feel it would be crucial to have a better public engagement at earlier stages of the project rather than having a public inquiry in the end of it? And how can this be facilitated?
Great. So David.
Yeah, you're right. The public is cynical about public engagement unless it actually means something. So it has to be real, and you have to have people that they engage with that can give them answers and listen. But you're right, the earlier we got involved in public engagement, the other thing is, if you went into the Chilterns, they'd say, well, we want a tunnel the whole way from London coming out in Birmingham. Well, naturally, that's what public engagement will give you. Some of it has to be practical. So one of the very earliest decisions I made on HS2 when I came on board early 2014, in the first 2 months, was to say, we're not going to connect the railway line to HS1. I know that's what you've designed. It's going to cost £1 billion. It's going to destroy Camden. It's going to foul up the freight network and screw up the North London line. And we don't need it. Why are we doing it? No one's going to go to sleep in Manchester and wake up in Paris. No one does that. So just get a plane. And it was one of those sorts of decisions that you knew from a public engagement point of view, we were going to fight years worth of huge public protests in Camden markets as we destroyed it. And why not? It's a beautiful area of London. So I think public engagement's important, has to be authentic, but there are some big picture decisions which are glaringly obvious that you need leadership, just make these decisions and move on and say, listen, for better or for worse, we've made it. You know, we've diverted the line around Yorkshire, half the group at there hate us, half of it don't, and the rest of them then said, you've engaged with us for 4 years, just make a damn decision and get on with it. So
Atif.
Public engagement, obviously, really important, particularly because infrastructure is sensitive. Cuts across right of way, it changes property values, it takes over people's land, hugely sensitive stuff. So we definitely need more of it. My sense is we need a mind switch on it. The problem is what people say is not what they do or even want. So you can engage them, and they might suggest a certain preference, but then when it actually happens, they change their mind, and then hate it. So it's very, very difficult. And dealing with students, I often experience that. So it's very difficult to come to agreements about what the public really wants. Preferences change over time, they're inconsistent, et cetera, et cetera. However, what people do consistently is very predictable. And that's the insight from behavioral economics and behavioral science. And we have mechanisms using crowdsourced technologies, what Waze does vis-a-vis what Google Maps does, to really just monitor people's actual behavior and try and plan around that. And that would allow for decisions that go much more in flow with social behavior patterns. So instead of trying to block jaywalking by putting lots of railings on certain roads, you can try and figure out where are people really crossing on streets by simply observing with drones of what the walking patterns across the street are. And based on the thickest lines you see, just providing easy access there. So I think we do have this, in planning, this obsession with making things fit our aesthetics rather than the way the world really is. And if we respect the way and humans really are, we'll end up with better infrastructure.
And I think that's quite a positive note to bring this Q&A to a conclusion. So we set out to explore, is there a role for big capital projects in a technology-driven world? And I think we've heard really it's about the integration of some of these new technologies and thinking about the interfaces, how we bring these things together, and to use these big capital projects to drive connectivity, to drive economic development, and also challenge some of the problems between the overheated centre in the UK and the north and bring these things through. But actually, I think Atif has provided a very powerful framework in looking at how we achieve scalability in the industry. But also, I think through the Q&A, we've explored some of the other things that need to be looked at, from the potential of blockchain and other technologies to drive a transformation of these organisations. But that's only going to be done if they're usable. And I think some of the points about CAD and other technologies have been well made. But it's not just technology, it's also a very significant leadership challenge. And I thought, Atif, your point about before the technology fix is the leadership fix. And if you're saying, Sir David, that the real cost is the decision-making process and how we do that and how we avoid, making these things have such a long time delay. So I invite you to now go and have a refreshment break in the main foyer. I believe we'll see you back here at 11. And I'd like to invite you to join me in thanking our two speakers.